Hi there, welcome to Pithy Polemics. We're a group of friends who are interested in discussing topics in philosophy, theology, history, fantasy, and more. My name is James Liang. This is the fifth video in a chapter-by-chapter series on Brian Davies' book, The Thought of Thomas Aquinas, which provides an overview of Aquinas' positions on a number of theological issues. In this video, I'll be discussing chapter 6 of the book, Ubiquity to Eternity, which discusses Aquinas' understanding of God's omnipresence, immutability, and relationship to time. Davies starts off by explaining that Aquinas viewed God's omnipresence as of special importance in his theology, invoking it constantly and including it more prominently in his system than many theologians do in theirs. He also holds a slightly different view of omnipresence, not only believing that God is aware of and causally active at every point in space, but also that God literally exists wholly in everything because he created and constantly sustains everything. This doesn't mean that God is spatial or material, nor that God is here nor there. In that sense, God is nowhere. Rather, the fact that there are any places we can point to at all is because of God's constant activity there. So in this sense, we can say that God is literally everywhere. Additionally, in being everywhere, God isn't divided into parts, since his whole being exists everywhere simultaneously, as per the doctrine of divine simplicity. To illustrate this, Davies says that if the only thing that existed was a grain of wheat, then that grain would exist everywhere, as there would be no space that grain doesn't occupy. However, even then, it wouldn't be omnipresent in the same way that God is, as that grain of wheat is still divisible into parts. Only a part of that grain exists at each point in space. On Aquinas' view, therefore, God is the only thing that can exist wholly everywhere. Finally, since God exists in everything and sustains everything, nothing exists outside of God's control. God is at work in the entire history of his created order, and everything that happens is an expression of his will. Davies then moves on to God's immutability. Remember from the first way that God is the cause of all change, so he himself cannot change. God can't change himself. He can't undergo either accidental or substantial change. No new attributes can be added to his essence. He's not just unchanging as a matter of fact, but unchangeable by his very nature. According to Aquinas, change implies potentiality and composition of parts. Since God is pure act and simple, he is utterly incapable of change. This then implies that God is eternal. Aquinas adopted Boethius' definition of eternity as the complete and total possession of unending life all at once, a life that is completely outside of time. Aquinas held to Aristotle's understanding of time as a measure of change, so because God doesn't change, he doesn't exist inside the temporal realm, and there's no succession, that is, before and after, in his life. He experiences his life all at once in an eternal present, lacking both beginning and end. Davies follows up with a few pages of discussion on a possible nuanced difference between eternity and timelessness on Aquinas' view. But I'll skip this part because it's a little esoteric, and as Davies admits in the chapter, he might be making a fuss about nothing. Then, Davies notes that although Aquinas' view of God's eternity and immutability is maintained in many historic Christian creeds, it's come under attack by modern theologians, and so he wants to explain how Aquinas would defend his position against some of their objections. The first objection is that in order to act and create things, there has to be a before and after in God's activities, and so God has to exist temporally and undergo change. In response, Davies says that Aquinas would insist that God's eternity and immutability don't make the positive claim that God is static, but merely say that God doesn't undergo succession or change. Secondly, he would say that acting doesn't necessarily produce a change in the actor, but could only produce a change in the being acted upon. So, on Aquinas' view, when something in creation changes, that's when God acts, but God himself isn't changing in any way when he acts. The second objection is that the Bible depicts God as a changing temporal being who is in constant interaction with man. Davies answers this by saying that 1. There are verses that say God doesn't change, and 2. Aquinas believed that Scripture needs to be interpreted according to what we already know, and since we already know that God is changeless, we should interpret verses that depict God as changing or acting in time figuratively. Davies abruptly ends this chapter here, so I guess it's time for my evaluation. Overall, I think this is a nice, brief, and informative chapter for anyone unfamiliar with the classical attributes of God, especially as Davies explains how Aquinas arrived at these attributes from prior attributes we looked at before. At this point in the book, it should be very apparent that on Thomism, pure actuality, divine simplicity, immutability, and timelessness all naturally follow from one another, and Davies strings these connections together effortlessly. I especially appreciate his section on addressing modern objections to divine timelessness, as it gives the reader a short glimpse of how the current debate around God's relationship to time goes. In this video, I'm just going to make a few brief remarks in rebuttal to Davies' presentation of these attributes. First of all, I see no need to go beyond the standard articulation of omnipresence Davies alludes to in the beginning, that God is aware of and causally active at every point in space. I just don't think it makes any sense to say that God is literally everywhere. Just because God acts constantly in sustaining all of creation doesn't mean that God is actually at every point in space, because he isn't at any point in space. He's non-spatial and immaterial. To argue otherwise feels to me like playing with words. In my video on Chapter 2, I critiqued the doctrine of divine simplicity on the grounds that it denies God the potential to do other than what he does in the actual world, entails the strange notion that God can't have any accidental properties, and leaves us with an inert and aloof God who doesn't stand in any real relations to his creatures. These problems all apply equally to immutability and timelessness. But there's another powerful objection that I haven't discussed yet, that creatio ex nihilo is impossible for an immutable and timeless God. Creatio ex nihilo is the biblical doctrine that God created the universe out of nothing, which is to say that the universe began to exist at a finite point in time. This would seem to require that there be an initial state in which God exists by himself, and a subsequent state in which God exists with the universe. In other words, there would seem to be a succession of moments in God's life. The problem for the Thomist is this: how can an immutable and timeless God produce such a change? This argument is stated more precisely in R.T. Mullen's book, The End of the Timeless God. 1. Temporal causes produce temporal effects. Timeless causes produce timeless effects. 2. God is timeless. 3. God willed that creation exist. 4. God's will causes creation to exist. 5. God's will is timeless. 6. Therefore, creation must be timeless. 7. But according to the Bible, creation is not timeless. Conclusion: therefore, one of these statements has to be rejected. According to Davies, Aquinas' solution is to reject the idea that timeless causes can only produce timeless effects. Perhaps God, in his single timeless act, can will that an effect occur at a specific moment in time, like a pill that takes effect sometime after you swallow it. But, as Mullins argues, Aquinas can't make this move because 1. These kinds of analogies rely on a temporal cause producing a temporal effect, and 2. For a simple God, his will is identical to his act. We're still owed a plausible explanation for how a timeless God can produce a temporal effect, and quite frankly, I'm quite skeptical that such an explanation exists. Mullins then goes further and argues that an immutable and timeless God can't sustain a temporal universe, and because the doctrine of preservation is essential to Aquinas' conception of omnipresence, an immutable and timeless God can't be omnipresent. In a temporal universe, one moment of time exists and then disappears, at which point the next moment of time begins. If God has to sustain the universe at one moment of time, and then sustain the universe at the next moment, it would seem as though God is undergoing change, which violates immutability. Furthermore, it's inexplicable how God in his eternal act can sustain past moments of time that no longer exist, and future moments of time that don't yet exist. As I see it, the intuitive way forward is just to do away with these problems altogether and allow that God is capable of undergoing change and exists in time along with everything else in creation. This also frees us to take the straightforward interpretation of God actually interacting with his creatures in time as depicted in scripture, instead of relegating all of these verses to figurative language. Sweet and simple. That's it for my thoughts. Next time, I'll be summarizing Chapter 7 of Davies' book, Oneness to Knowledge, which explains Aquinas' account of God's unity, omnipotence, and omniscience. I hope you enjoyed this video. If this has been helpful to you, please help us out and like, share, and subscribe. Also make sure to hit that bell button for notifications. If you think I'm onto something or you think I'm dead wrong, Please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this content, come check out our channel for more videos on interesting topics and discussions. With that, I'll see you in the next video.